some of her work or all of it?
Yeah, it's
Maybe?
all there. Everything I've
Yeah.
published, even though it's
Cool.
it's already copyrighted by somebody else, I don't care, and I put it on my website. So, I mean, I think there's maybe one or two that take you to the book, because I sometimes have to wait like 3 months before, you know, but you can go to the book, and then if you have access through Oxford or whatever in the library, you can get it. But all the rest, so this one is about to come out. I just am sending it off. This one, that's just the book, but you get what I'm talking about.
Anyway, you do have the links for the papers and all that stuff. So I do encourage you to go and have a look at her work. And the idea of this activity is more, I mean, the idea is to have a conversation, and it's not meant to be a lecture-like thing. So I do encourage you also to contribute to it. And
Yeah.
I think that's it.
That's it.
And the toilets are just around the corner if anyone needs them. So Sally, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Leandro, and thank you, Miriam, also for having me in Chile. It's been a total joy. I just love it here. It's my first time ever in Chile, and so I've been in Santiago and now Temuco, and it's just been such a pleasure. Thank you for listening to me in English. I don't speak Spanish, and though I'm more and more committed to trying to learn as I have been here, and I was in Brazil and Peru earlier in October, so now I am totally motivated. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint so that you so you can read while I'm talking, and I will stop at each section for questions, and feel free to ask me anything. If it's just you didn't understand something or the word is unfamiliar or whatever, just raise your hand. I'm here to have a conversation, to learn from you, and for you to learn from me. Okay, so let's get out of this and get back into this. Come. Okay, so this is a murmuration of starlings. It's birds, and they just move through the air in this beautiful way without anybody controlling it or anybody in charge. And that's how I think societies are, just as a little background on my way of thinking about society. We're just in here, and if one of these birds starts to go like that, then that moves everybody else. It takes more than one of us, but oh well. Here, if you want to download the whole presentation, you can just go there, just QR it, and then you can go back and forth on your own in the presentation if that would be helpful. Feel free. And I was supposed to cover this up because I've stolen this image from Tom Langland's photography, but it's on Google Images, so. Is it coming up for somebody? Do you getting it?
Yeah.
It's come up? Okay. So I'm going to start with an introduction, and then I'm going to situate social critique. In the introduction, I'll say the problem I'm thinking about. Then I'm going to talk about oppositional consciousness through a case study. I've been telling Miriam I always work through case studies, through examples. Then I'm trying to develop what I think is implicit in some of this, and there are more cases. This just happens to be a famous case. I'm going to try and develop an oppositional political epistemology, so how we can know that our current situation is bad and move to claim that it's bad in a warranted way against the dominant structure. That's the idea. And then I'll draw a conclusion. Okay, the introduction. So my recent work defends a practice-based account of ideology. I'm going to tell you about it in the next slide. And on my view, social practices and social structures depend on a collection of social meanings that provide a stage setting for action, and they're a constituent part of the local social regulation system. So these are social meanings. They don't, just live in our heads. They live in public space, but we internalize them And so we are able to coordinate because we have these shared meanings. And so think of as a practice, and Leandro and Marina, we've heard this before, but when you walked in here today, I assume that none of you deliberated about whether you would be sitting on this table for the whole session, right? You didn't even consider it, right? You didn't have to consider it. That's because you're fluent in a social practice of a seminar or an academic lecture or something. So it just rules out some options. You don't even have to think about them because you're fluent in that practice. So I'm interested in these practices, and there are social meanings. So the meaning of the screen, the meaning of the microphone and the table, those immediately mean things to you, and so you're responsive to those meanings. And we all know about them. Otherwise, and that enables us to coordinate, right? Because if some of you knew and some of you didn't, then we would bump into each other and I'd be saying, excuse me, like that. So we all know these and we follow them so that we can coordinate more efficiently. Okay, so I call these, what's up here, a cultural techne. So it's kind of the tools. And I don't use the word culture straight because culture has so many meanings, and it suggests that there's one homogeneous sort of hegemonic culture that we're all in, but we're not. They were all fragmented and have different practices. And so these are tools that we rely on when we're trying to coordinate. And as you probably know, when you go to a very different place, like me in Chile, the tools that I have in the United States aren't always the right tools. And so I'm kind of grabbing another tool, and then someone has to, Leandro has to say, no, we don't do it that way. And so then I go, okay, give me the tool so that I can now coordinate with you, right? This is why. And I don't have to learn all of Chilean culture in order to sit down and have a meal with you. I just have to learn some of the tools to engage in the practices. And notice that there's some practices like this one that I share with people all over the world, right? I've traveled all over the world and given talks, and it's just like this, right? So you have academic, talk tools that are very transposable to other situations, even if you wouldn't be able to order a coffee, right, in some of these places. And then some of the things, like if I'm talking to my neighbors, and I say, well, everybody sit down at the table, and I will stand up and I'll talk to you. They'll look at me like, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. Because those tools don't work in the neighborhood, right? Just this, am I speaking too fast? Do you want me to slow down? If anyone wants me to slow down, just say, slow down. I'm cool with that. Okay, so they enable us to coordinate by providing the paths and signals of our practices. Now, an ideology is a cultural techne gone wrong. And in this sense, means that it prevents us from recognizing or creating forms of value and or organizes us in unjust ways. So there are going to be some tools up here which trigger us to respond to the world in different practices that are bad. So for example, in the United States, seeing someone with dark skin and very curly hair and maybe a slightly flattened nose and big lips, you respond to them. I mean, the ordinary practices around that are very different than what it would be for someone like me, right? So there's a racialization part of the cultural techne, and the meaning of the dark skin, the meaning of the very curly hair, the meaning of the wider lips, engages me in a practice of, well, not me, but some people, in a practice of treating that person as inferior, right? So that would be a cultural technique gone wrong. It is a tools of racialization. The tools of subordination are in this cultural technique, and that is ideology from my point of view.
Just one question, why subordination helps us to coordinate more efficiently? Or how it started?
Oh, how it started. Well, I think it enables us to more efficiently in a system that is already sort of presupposing some of that. Because if I start acting in a way that doesn't take into account these signals, then even the people that I'm talking to, even a black man I'm talking to, might find my reaction weird, right? Might think, I'm not used to white people talking like this to me, or something like that. And that may interfere with our coordination, because this is how the dominant system works. But how they started, that's a much harder question. I don't think I can give a short answer to.
But it's not because it was an efficient coordination?
Well, it's tricky. I talked a bit about this yesterday. We need a division of labor. and we need a division of labor. Every society needs a division of labor. If we're all doing the same thing all the time, it's difficult to develop expertise. Expertise is really good for us because expertise requires some people learn a lot about something and other people learn a lot about something else, and then we work together, you know, to make things better for all of us, right? So divisions of labor are absolutely crucial, right, from the very beginning. And then what we need to have a division of labor is a way to mark who goes into what role, right? So we talked about gender. Gender was a marking that was very early, so breasts and, you know, shape of your body, etc., indicated to people that you had a certain reproductive role. And so organizing around reproduction, around childcare, around all of those things sort of started to attach to the appearance of women's bodies. And so that was one of the beginning. But race is also, what happens is the colonizers come in and they feel as though they're entitled to this land that they've just discovered. And so then they racialize the people that they are conquering and subordinate them, and they feel that that's efficient because it's efficient for their purposes. You know, for their purposes is to extract the value of the land and the labor, and that's very efficient for them. And then there's a battle because people say, no, you can't do that to me. And they say, oh, yes, we can. And then it ends up being efficient for capitalism. I mean, that's, okay, that's like the history of the last several hundred years, you know, in 2 minutes. Does that make sense? And so the marking of, and it's marking by clothes, it's marking by, you know, costume, I mean, whatever it might be that you wear, it's marking by hair length, it's marking by, you know, all of these different eye shapes. For Asian, there's going to be an Asian. You look at someone and boom, you don't even have to think about it. It just happens. They're marked, and then you respond to them differently. Okay. Okay. My task today is to say more about the basis for normative evaluation. So how do we know when something's gone wrong, right? Because for the colonizers, it wasn't going wrong. It was going great. You know, we love it. Let's keep doing this or whatever. And ideology critique, I think, which is when we say this is a cultural technique that's gone wrong, is an important part of efforts to promote social justice. But when can we do that? When are we entitled to say this ideology has gone wrong? It either prevents us from recognizing or creating forms of value or organizes in unjust ways. So let's use capitalism, for example. Capitalism, I think, is bad in both of these ways because it suggests that the value of anything is its exchange value. So even women's bodies have a price. You know, you can sex work or rent a womb. I don't know if you know about this, but in India, there's a lot of affluent white women in New York who don't want to be pregnant, and so they send their gametes to India, and then they have other people bear the child, and then they take them back. So this is a commodification of women's bodies, and we all know that happens. But it's also a commodification of everything, of art. You know, art is commodified. Education is commodified. Everything gets commodified, and that is because we have failed to recognize certain forms of value. So I am a pluralist about value. I'm not, so for example, I don't know if you know about utilitarianism. Do you know? I should have gone around and asked what disciplines you're in, because that would have helped a bit. Anyway, a utilitarian will say you have to maximize pleasure, or maximize welfare, or maximize this or that or the other. And it suggests that there's just a single scale of value, right? There's going to be sort of extreme pleasure and extreme pain. And what we're trying to do is move ourselves up here and have more pleasure and less pain. It's a very simplistic way of thinking about value, I think. And so I'm a pluralist, and I think that there are many, there's artistic value, there's the value of nature, there's the value of human beings, there's the value of animals, lots of different kinds of value, and we have to do justice to all of them. So this is sometimes called an objective list theory of value, but we don't have to get into that. Just as long as there are many of them, and I don't have to make the argument that they're objective. I don't care so much about that for our purposes. Okay, And the other thing that capitalism does is it organizes us in unjust ways, right? It organizes us so that we exploit the workers and women and people like that. So in terms of a cultural techne, I think there are many bits and pieces of capitalist ideology in here that distorts what's valuable and prevents us from organizing in ways that are appropriate. Does that make sense? Do you have questions about that? Okay, and you don't actually have to believe what I say about capitalism. I mean, I use it as an example. If you're a fan of capitalism, we can find another example. I just wanted to sort of get the distinction for your purposes. I'm not going to argue that capitalism is the paradigm example. I'm just trying to make the point. Okay, so here we are, and this is my theory of social practices. I'm going to try and go through it quickly. Here we are. We're just bubble people. We don't have genitalia or hair or eye color. We're just, so this is supposed to be prior to our, it's an image that might suggest that it's possible to live as humans without culture, but we can't, right? We are always embedded in a culture. But so here is my view of social meanings. So here are the public social meanings, and here are what I call, or what the tradition that I'm in calls resources, which are things are positively or negatively valued. So resource in English tends to be a positive thing. Something is a resource if it's good. But in this tradition, resources are also used for things that are bad. There are things like toxic waste, things that have negative value or positive value. And the thing is that if we've come to recognize something as having positive or negative value, we have to start arranging ourselves in relation to it, right? We have to coordinate to make more of it, to make less of it, to dispose it, to distribute it, to do all those sorts of things. Right? So, for the bunny, for example, there are a variety of ways that our social meanings could interpret this as valuable. Its value as a pet, or as food, or as a pelt. You know, you make a hat out of it, a wild animal. And we were talking the other day, it could be pest. You know, so that would be negatively valued if you live, like in my garden, rabbits are pests. You know, they're wild animal pests. So there's a negative. So there has to be a way that we interact with it. And again, these are public, and they're going to be such that we presume some similar things. So when, in my neighborhood, if you start killing the bunnies because they're a pest, people would be horrified. And they go, oh no, don't kill the bunnies, they're wild animals. We have to preserve the wild animals, or something like that. But if you go somewhere else and you have a pet bunny, and it's, you know, you let it go in your yard, and someone comes along and says, food, and they take it and they want to eat it, oh, you go, no, that's my pet bunny, right? So these are really important for coordinating around something that could be positive or negative, depending. Okay, so then they include, in this, I want to say, I don't have a very precise theory of what goes in that bucket. It's a bucket of things which are kind of heterogeneous. There's a lot of stuff I need to sort out, and I haven't figured it. But it will include rules, norms, laws, signs, default assumptions, default inferences, things like that. Lots of different things in there. Okay, so what happens is that we internalize these public ones, and they filter and shape our experience. So when you walk in a room, for example, this is an academic setting, what you notice is where the chairs are that are around the table and where the screen is, and you notice certain things and not other things. So, for example, I was in Santiago, and I was in a rush to get myself set up on the first day, and then the second day, if someone had asked me what color were the chairs, it's like, I don't know what color the chairs are, right? I wasn't paying attention to the chairs. I wasn't noticing the chairs because I didn't need to. There was no practice that I was going to have to rely on that needed me to remember the colors of the chairs. So these filter our experience, and then we shape attitudes based on it, like what we want, a pet, what we don't want is a pest, and that guides our behavior, and this reinforces. So if bunnies are pets, then we breed them to be fat and slow and not run away and, you know, allow you to be picked up and things like that. So that reinforces that bunnies are great pets, right? and you have pet bunnies rather than pest bunnies. Okay, so here's another example. Here's a woman. She could be a friend or a mother or a sex object. This is an African-American man, I'm assuming, a friend, a janitor, or a criminal. And these tools are all available there for you to rely on. And I think just seeing someone and assuming that they're a janitor or a criminal, that is subordinating, right? That is inappropriate. My colleague in linguistics, who's a black man from Haiti, he wears very nice clothes to work, like suit jackets and like button-down shirts, where most of my colleagues wear t-shirts. I mean, they're not dressed up. And you ask him why, he said, because otherwise people assume I'm a janitor, right? And they treat him like a janitor. And he says, so this shows that I'm not a janitor. And it happens, right? It happens. And of course, when people assume that black men are criminals, don't get me started. Okay, so in words, social practices are patterns of learned behavior. So this is what makes them social and not innate. We learn them. That enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, or eliminating a resource, so positive or negative, due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resource, as interpreted through these meanings. So we can know that a meaning is not working if it's supposed to coordinate us and in fact it fails. So you might think mushrooms are edible, you go out and not have any fine-grained distinctions between mushrooms, and you say, ah, great, mushrooms are edible, and so you see a mushroom and you eat it and you die or you get very sick. That social meaning is not. We have to refine our social meaning of mushroom so that we're very alert to the distinction between edible and inedible mushrooms. Okay, so the world pushes back on my view.
Can I ask you
Please.
something?
Yes.
So it's the idea that we have many of these things linked to one sort of a type. For instance,
Yeah.
a black person could be a friend, a janitor, a criminal, but it couldn't be a CEO or something
Yeah,
like that.
that's right.
And then,
And
I
also
suppose friend
dangerous
is
is-
gonna, friend is gonna apply when it's someone you know and whatever, and special circumstances.
Yeah.
But then, I'm wondering how they get triggered, right?
Yeah.
These different categories
Yeah.
with which we
So-
associate the type.
So what I think, and this is pretty sketchy still, is that there's sort of default norms and assumptions. So in some context, the markings on the body trigger the criminal response. In other contexts, they will trigger the janitor response. So at MIT, I think most people think it's likely not criminals walking around, you know, they might be a student or a postdoc or a janitor or a grounds person who takes care of the grounds, but they're probably not a criminal. So they have to sort through. Professor tends not to be here when you're thinking about, you know, and so what they have is they say, that's not my friend, that's probably not a criminal, must be a janitor, right? And so it's the markings that are associated with these properties that are linked up here in the default assumptions.
So you were saying that they guide your perception, maybe they guide your attention, right,
Totally.
to certain perceptual cue.
Yeah.
What if you don't find them? Because it's not my friend. I don't see an outfit that looks like a janitor.
Yeah.
Is it criminal then?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
I mean, but I don't see anything dodgy with him. Or,
Yeah. And so I think then what happens is that there might be cognitive dissonance. You're going, who is this person? What is he doing here? And so you reach back in this grab bag and you say, could he be a professor? You know, and then maybe you bring that out. But it's tentative and it's a reach to sort of see it that way. Because the way I'm thinking about it, and this, again, I could use your help with, is that you have a person here, let's say, okay, person here, and then there are these nearby options, janitor, and, well, they won't put friend, but criminal. And those are close to what, and then they say, oh, if it's a criminal, call the cops. If it's a janitor, ignore, etc. And then, if these aren't working, then you kind of reach further out to see if there's something else. But they have these norms associated with them. So you say, professor? But this one is fragilely, it's a kind of fragile guess that is going to guide your behavior. And so if this person acts in any way suspicious, you drop it and you go back to one of those. That's how I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
Is that help?
Yeah.
Help? Yes?
I have a question. This schema is not for everyone, because for this guy from the black community, the person that he's seeing in his neighborhood won't think he's a janitor or a criminal.
Right.
He will think it's a friend,
Yeah.
a relative. There is a difference.
Oh, it's very context sensitive. So as I was saying at MIT, we'll probably not think it's a criminal. So here's MIT has a big dome that's, this is the dome of MIT. And I was sort of speaking about MIT, but they're going to be, so this is kind of what happens. There's a dominant, come in. Yeah, good. So I think there are dominant technes. And then there's going to be lots of different kind of some of them are going to be counterpublics, which are opposing the dominant technes. So the LGBTQ community in a queer bar or something, they're going to have their own set of technes about how to read people's bodies. In the black community, in a black neighborhood, completely different. And some of those are actively resisting the dominant techne. Some of them are just different, right? You have a Puerto Rican community and they speak Spanish there and they do things differently, eat different food, but it's not necessarily resistant. So they're going to be, but when you kind of go out of your community, you have to have some sort of default assumptions about how people are going to respond. And so oftentimes, and this is going to be a resource in a minute, and so you say, okay, I'm not going to speak Spanish when I go to work, even though I do, because the dominant techne is English. And I'm not going to wear, a t-shirt and jeans when I go to work. I'm going to go into the work and do the dominant techne. And so we're oftentimes traveling back and forth. And that's why I don't like this broad idea of culture, because it's always cultures, right? And so in the park, when I take my kid to the park, there's a whole separate culture with my kid in the park, with the other moms. Or I'm a dog person. I have this whole community of people who are dog walkers, and I don't know any of their last names, right? We know our dogs' names. We forget each other's names. It doesn't matter if you forget each other's names, as long as you remember the dogs' names. And so there's a whole, you know what I mean? So we're traveling across these technes, and all of them are in principle available in this, but some people are, but I will say it and then I'll take it back because I don't have a better word. Some people are blind to these others, and they don't include those in their communities. And I hesitate to use blind because the disability movement resists using term blind as a way of talking about a lack. And I apologize for that. I couldn't think of another term. I have other terms for some disabilities, but this one I just couldn't come up with. So please understand, I do not think that blind people are lesser or whatever. But they don't see them, and so they might be only familiar with this one and maybe a couple of other, because they're rich. The rich have their own techne, and they may have the white have their own techne. And so this is where they live. And of course, these are much closer to the dominant techne than all of these others. And so there's less switching. But switching is what gives you a basis for critique. So we're going to have, double consciousness and things like that. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Okay. So this is the big picture that's sort of behind my work that I've been doing for a while now. But I think it helps to motivate the questions. Okay, so the challenge for ideology critique. Under conditions of ideology, there is, by hypothesis, a range of unjust social practices that oppress a group. However, not everyone experiences the oppression as such. Fluent social agents will identify with their role and see no need for critique. And as a result, in social movements that seek to undermine oppression, there's a risk that those engaged in the critique are illegitimately imposing their values on others. So how should we proceed? So an example is like my mother. She was born in 1916. She's died in 1983. She was completely identified with her role as a wife and mother. She was very upset that I was a feminist. She thought it was a criticism of her personally. And so it's very difficult because, at least in the United States, I'm sure here too, many women are totally invested in their roles, right? They think this is what I should do. This is either my nature or the church metaphysics says this is what I should do, et cetera, et cetera. And so they see no need for critique, but we're coming in as feminists and saying, excuse me, this is not good. And so there's a conflict here of values. And so the problem for ideology critique is that, of course, you want to respect the values of other people, but you also are worried that if you impose your values on other people, then you're doing something wrong, right? And so how do you deal? Does that make sense? Is that a serious question? Okay. Okay, so there are two options that have been presented in the critical theory tradition. One is external critique. So you come from outside and you say, well, I have the truth about morality. Kant told us about the categorical imperative, and you're not obeying the categorical imperative, or whatever, you know, find your, or in America we do it this way. This is the best way. And so you're not doing it our way, that's a bad thing. You know, things like that. And so, but the problem is, if we rely on beliefs and values that aren't broadly accepted in the context, our critique will be at best ineffective or at worst paternalistic. So we're trying to impose capitalist values, you know, Western values, Northern values, whichever, on another group of people. Okay, then there's internal critique. And internal critique is you say, oh, you have the resources and the values in your own system of values to critique yourselves, right? Now, there are different versions. There's internal critique and immanent. I'm not really going to talk about immanent critique, though it's better than this looks like. But the basic idea is you're relying on beliefs and values that are internal to the ideology. But then it's not that likely that the critique is going to identify the wrongs fully, right? If you think of traditional women, the trad wife, I don't know if you have heard that. There's this new trend in the US to be a trad wife, which is to go back to everything that traditional women were, you know, and even people who once had fancy jobs now are saying, no, the trad wife is better. And so then you're looking in the trad wife beliefs and values to find feminism. It's not going to often get really at the bottom of things, at what's really wrong. Okay, but there may be something there we need, and I believe there is something in these that we need. Okay, so if there is an external, if internal and external don't work, oh, it looks like they're exhaustive. One is from outside, one is from inside and outside. It's not clear what else you have. Okay, so I'm going to have to make clear what exactly the project is about first, and then we'll go on. So as social critics, I think we need to distinguish the justification problem, whether we have a justified complaint against the current social order that some practice or set is harmful or unjust. The illumination problem, how do we get others to recognize their oppression and form the movement? These are two different questions, right? So you may have a warranted critique, but not know how to get people to accept it. But if you're trying to change people's lives, you better be justified. Because if you're not justified, you're changing their lives, and you shouldn't be, it seems to me. So I think that's possible, this is questionable, but I think it's possible to pull these apart a little bit. And today I'm not really talking about illumination. In fact, I think that ad agencies are better, you know, advertising people and people who actually work, leaders of social movements, they're much better at this. I'm a philosopher, so I end up thinking more about that. Then there's a political problem, what we collectively should do about the injustice, how to decide, and the problem is that rarely can all pro tanto claims, that is, the claims that on the face of it are plausible, be adequately addressed, right? How can, so once I have this justification, I bring it to a democratic community, and they vote it down. It's like, whoa, so then I gotta do something. I gotta go around illuminating people in order to answer the political problem. And one of the things that's been really interesting, there's some really interesting work about the challenges that, say, African Americans face, and I'm sure it's true in the Mapuche people and other people in Chile, is that you're not in the majority. And so in a democracy, you can keep getting voted down and voted down and voted down and voted down. So how do you deal with that? And that comes in this political problem. So I'm not really going to talk about these issues, though I think they're important and we need to have solutions. And I only have like an hour and a half more, so I'm just going to focus on this one. But ask me questions about the others. Let's see. How many? So I think I have just one more slide, and then we'll stop for questions. Okay, this is Robin Selacates, a very, very, very good friend of mine. And he says that ideology critique faces two distinctive challenges in the justification issue. The methodological or epistemological, he uses both terms. From what standpoint does the critic speak? Traditionally, critical theory is embedded in a social movement and aims to articulate the interests and demands of the oppressed. But then the question is, which insights of which agents, given they're not a homogeneous category, that the critical theorist articulates? So you've got all of these people, and we're trying to articulate a critique. But they're going to, whose critique, whose side are we on, and how do we decide who are the people within that? So even if you have, suppose you have a large number of women, they're going to disagree. The women are going to disagree. And so you say, I fight for women. You go, which women, right, are you fighting for? And this is, which insights of which agents are you supposed to be articulating? And if you don't have a theory of what is valuable, it's going to be hard to decide, right? Because the trad wives and the feminists, they disagree. They're all women, right? And they all have a conception of value, but you have to figure out what side you're on. I'll come back to you. I see you have a question. Okay, and then there's the explanatory challenge. If ideology functions at the level of a system, what exactly holds together the broad conglomeration of partly psychological, partly social mechanisms, from implicit biases to stereotypes to looping effects, that make them into one element of one ideology, and how does critique disrupt the systematic injustice that the ideology sustains? So the issue here is all of these technes are together supporting a system. But this is the system. And they're all intertwined. All of these, racism is connected to sexism, which is connected to ableism, which is connected to anti-migrants. All of these are connected. And so if I'm over here saying, oh, yes, and I should put the fist. Anyway, you probably haven't seen that. There's a fist for the feminist symbol. If I'm saying, okay, feminism, and then I'm trying to intervene in the system, but wait a minute. There are all of these other challenges that are intertwined, and how do we really address them if we're just coming in with the voice of, say, okay, we're just going to talk about the feminists. How are the ideologies connected in a way that sustains the systematic injustice, right? Because you're not going to undo this whole system simply by saying, okay, you folks, we're going to give you power. Yay, you have power, but the system carries on. Okay, so this is time for the next. So more questions. Yes?
I have 3 questions.
Oh, yay, okay.
The first one is in general. When you were talking about the mere definition of ideology for you, it's a cultural technique gone wrong, you said, but then when can we say it has gone wrong?
Yeah.
So there I see a contradiction, because you say it's a cultural technique gone wrong, but then sometimes it might go wrong, sometimes not, and sometimes we might say it has. So I didn't know if it was really that definition so dogmatic like that, a cultural technique gone wrong. Maybe not.
Well, this is what I'm trying to say. How do we say it's gone wrong? What does it say? What does it mean to say it's gone wrong? How can we judge the value? Where do the values come from when we say it's gone wrong? That's the main thing.
Right, how we recognize it.
How do we recognize that it has gone
so
wrong?
it's not necessarily a technique gone wrong. Or it has always gone wrong.
Oh yeah, I think it's, I mean, like
Okay.
gender, the division of gender that situates women as the caregivers of the dependents, that's been wrong since the beginning of time.
Okay.
It's like always wrong. We should not organize life that way,
Right.
because that systematically disadvantages the women. Now, I actually think it's worse than that, and this is a bigger problem, I think any division of labor that situates one group of people in the role of taking care of the dependents, that disadvantages that group of people. We need to share that across different groups. And if you don't do it, then that group is going to be disadvantaged. So it's a big claim, and I think that if you want me to, I can talk a bit more about it. But it's always been wrong, and until we do something about it, we're going to be stuck.
Understand. It's not. I'm not judging that the definition. It's just that in some traditions, ideology is something like very natural, and that we cannot get rid of.
Yeah.
So that's. Only
But we have gotten rid of a lot of ideologies, right? Feudalism. Feudalism had an ideology that, or slavery. Slavery had an ideology.
So your definition is always negative, something that has gone
Yeah.
wrong and
It's a
should get rid of.
pejorative term.
It's a pejorative term.
Yeah.
Because I take it in the continental philosophy,
Exactly,
sort of
yeah.
tradition, like prejudice, can be a positive thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh,
No,
it's
in
not
the
like
so
that.
in the
To
Yeah.
have it. So.
Yeah.
yeah, no, in the French habitus notion, like
Yeah.
that's not what I mean. And it's also in the American tradition, it's any, political point of view or something like that. But in the Frankfurt School critical tradition, it's always going to be an internalization of a background set of ideas that sustain oppression. So it's always going to be oppression.
And oppression can be eliminated. So that's
Well, I don't know. We talked about this. That's beyond my pay grade, right? Someone else has to. It's an empirical question. I don't know. I can't figure that out. But some forms of oppression can be eliminated. I mean, slavery was not completely eliminated. There's still sexual slaves. There are still slaves in some part of the world. But I can say that in the United States, I think that, the slavery that the Civil War was fought over has been eliminated. That's all I want to say.
There are other ways of slavery today.
That's what I was saying. There's sexual slavery. There's all kinds of other slavery. Okay, yeah, totally. And wage slaves, if you want to get to there. But there are also slaves of immigrants who come across to do field work, and they're slaves. But it's just so there's a particular forms can be eliminated, but there are going to be other forms that we have to always keep working on. Something you said trigger. I'll try and remember if I don't remember. But go ahead. You had a third question.
Two more.
Okay. Okay.
But I'm going to be fast, I think.
What's your name?
Erica.
Erica. Okay. What is your name?
Mariela.
Okay. Maria.
Mariela.
Marila. Got it.
So about the politics problem, or maybe the epistemological also, what do you think about what are for you the roles or the role of the image of the flood was very cool, because I want to ask about the les oiseaux égarés, the birds that are going out of the flood.
Oh yes, I
So,
see what you mean.
Those
Yeah.
groups, who are for you those groups? So maybe I was thinking about asking about avant-gardes or militants, or what are those groups for you in society that make the change, who are they, and what are their roles?
Yeah, this is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So hold on to that question, and then ask it again at the end, okay?
And the last one?
Yeah.
It's about the role, for you, in your thought, what role has the unconscious?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
Subjective and collective and unconscious.
Yeah, so I think psychoanalysis is mostly bunk. I know a lot of people think, whoa, how can you say that? But I do. But I think there's all kinds of unconscious desires and beliefs and those sorts of things. And so I think you had unconscious beliefs when you walked in here about where you should sit and what role you played in this, and you weren't deliberating about it, it wasn't conscious, none of that. So I think that it's like the Bourdieu habitus. I mean, it sounded like you knew about Bourdieu. Do you know about Bourdieu? No. Bourdieu? Yeah. Bourdieu. I mean, anyway, so he has the habit, and so you have all of these dispositions that you can interpret as beliefs that are totally unconscious. And so I believe in the unconscious. It's just that I don't believe in the drives and all of that stuff, and the Oedipal complex and all of that stuff that comes with Freud. That, I think, is problematic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and you don't need to commit to
No.
that stuff. I mean, you just talk about subpersonal mechanisms,
That's right.
heuristics, or whatever.
That's
that
right.
Just automatically make you
Yeah,
react.
dispositions
Yeah.
that has been trained into you and all of that kind of stuff. I don't need anything deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has a question. I can ask.
Yeah, please.
I have a problem looking for those practices that we see like an injustice practice, and what's if it's part of our own ideology
I
to
know.
look at them like an injustice practice,
Yeah.
and what give us the moral correct position to judge them? I
Yeah.
don't know if you can understand.
No, I know. This is what I'm worried about, right? What I'm worried about is, like, I go into Kenya, like I work in Kenya, and I say, this is really bad. We have to change this. What gives me the right to go into Kenya and say that, right? So that's a worry I have. Because being a white woman from the United States, you know, who's fairly affluent, and the history of colonialism, believe me, it worries me. You know, it worries me. And that's partly what this is about. Okay? Let me just bear with me.
Yeah, just one thing. When you were talking about trad wives and feminism, still that's very rough. Right?
Yeah.
Because within feminism, you still have different groups.
Oh,
I mean,
totally.
You couldn't just group
Yeah. No.
a
Yeah.
bunch of people into feminism.
No, you can't. So so one of the important distinctions between different types of feminism is what's sometimes called the humanist feminism, which think that what we need is to enable women to access everything that men have, right? So be CEOs, be professors, be whatever. This is what what feminism is trying to do, and a lot of people, Iris Young in particular, thinks that is way inadequate because it presumes the structure is just fine and we just got to get to the top. But of course not everybody can live at the top, etc., etc. The structure is broken, etc., etc. So she thinks that one of the main alternatives is what she calls, not a pretty word, gynocentrism, gyno for women, and that says, look, women have historically had really great values. I mean, this is why, you know, women have been central to the peace movements, have been central to ecofeminism has been really important. There are lots of different things that women have suggested as a source of criticism of masculine culture and masculinism more generally, and that we need to look more closely and at values that have historically been women's values and revalue them, sort of revalue the home, revalue caretaking, for example. Care, peace, nature. These are things that women have historically fought for. And to say, oh no, what feminism is going to do is make you a CEO is like, please, no. And instead, we try to build into feminism a kind of attention to things that have historically been devalued. So that just as an example of the varieties of feminism. So some aspects, so that's why I said not everything about trad wives is bad. Because trad wives are very concerned with care, right? They're doing a lot of care. They're doing a lot of growing their own food, right? So but they also think they should defer to their husbands. You know, it's kind of like,
Should what?
defer to their husbands. They should do what their husbands tell them to
Okay.
do. Yeah. I don't like that part. Not so good. That's not so good. You know, yeah, cook your own food, but not because your husband told you to. Okay. Are we ready to go? Are we good? Are we good? It's all going okay. Everybody on. Do you feel included? I want you. Some of you have been very quiet, and I want you to feel like you can ask a question at any time. Okay. You're. Okay, and if you find it awkward to speak English, ask it in Spanish, and we have translators here who will translate it.
Just told them.
Oh, that, okay. We think alike. Yeah, no, really, don't feel awkward about English, and tell me to slow down, etc., or speak to Miriam. Tell Miriam to tell me to slow down, okay? Say. Okay, so here we are in situating social critique. One strategy for gaining moral knowledge is to draw on the situated knowledge of the oppressed because they have a kind of privileged access to the experience of oppression. So this comes straight out of Marx, right? Marx says the proletariat have a deep interest in understanding the experience of the oppressed. They are the oppressed, they have that experience, and the capitalists don't have that experience, and so the proletariat have a privileged access, right? Very, very, very standard. But simply including diverse knowers as sources of situated knowledge, taken at face value, is also insufficient. A critical standpoint is necessary. If we assume that the oppressed are typically invested in the practices and roles they occupy, is their position epistemically privileged? We need a critical standpoint. So this is why Marx thought that the ordinary worker wasn't necessarily epistemically privileged, and you had to form a proletariat, right? You had to, and so this is, I mean, he talks about in the 17th Brumaire at the end, he's saying, like, the French peasants are potatoes in a sack of potatoes. They have common interests, but they don't even know it. They don't recognize it. They can't even identify their source. And it's difficult because they're also peasants and they're spread out. And so they're vulnerable, he thinks, to Napoleon's power. And I think there's a lot similar here with Trump, but that's beside the point. But what you have to do is take the potatoes in the sack of potatoes and give them a critical consciousness, give them freedom to articulate with and to each other the experience of oppression and the harms of oppression. So merely having situated knowledge is not enough. You have to, thank you, you have to find a critical standpoint. A critical standpoint, I think, can be achieved through consciousness raising. Consciousness raising offers a paradigm shift that cannot simply be derived from our existing moral framework. But not all epistemic practices that appear to raise consciousness are warranted. So the neo-Nazis. The neo-Nazis may say, oh, I went to a meeting and my consciousness was raised and I see, you know, that white people, the Aryan race ought to take over the earth or whatever like that. So we have to be thinking about what it means to raise consciousness. Nevertheless, under certain conditions that I'm trying to specify, consciousness raising produces a warranted critical standpoint and a pro tanto claim against others through a process of inquiry. Again, it's not all things considered the right thing to do, but it's at least a strong reason to do it, even if it can be overridden in some cases. So I want to say a little bit about paradigm shifts. So there is this guy, Thomas Kuhn, K-U-H-N, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he said, and I think his views about science are similar in many ways to my views in this epistemology. And he had what he called normal science. And normal science is just chugging along, doing what your professor is asking you to do to learn how to do the experiments, and then getting a job where you do those experiments and whatever. And everybody knows in normal science there are cases, examples, etc., that don't fit the theory, right? There's always situations that don't fit the theory. But we go along because it's the best theory we have. And then along comes someone and sees all of those cases that don't fit the theory and provides a new theory that captures everything the old theory captured and those problematic cases. But it's a paradigm shift. You have to kind of look at things differently. Okay, that is what I think happens in consciousness raising. You're going along, minding your business, and then you read Marx, and you hadn't thought about the worker, and you hadn't thought about their wages or all of these sorts of things. And this includes workers. And then you read Marx and you go, exploitation. Oh my God, the value of the worker's labor is being appropriated by the capitalist, and this happens all over the place. And suddenly the world looks different, right? It just looks very different. Or you go along, living your life as a woman, and then something happens, and you think typically what happens in the cases where you don't yet have a critical standpoint, you don't fit in here and you don't fit in there and you're uncomfortable here and you do badly at this, and you think, oh, something must be wrong with me. I'm not really good enough. I'm not really, a good woman, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not this enough, or I'm not that enough. And then there's a moment where you find someone else usually, and they say, oh, stop it, you're fantastic. It was just the stupid professor who didn't understand your point. And then you talk, and then you go, oh, it's not me that's the problem. It's something else that's the problem. Boom! Consciousness raising happens. Well, I wish it were that fast. But that's the idea. Suddenly you shift from seeing all the problems to be a problem about you, and now you see it to be a problem. No, the world is the problem, not me. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about, how that happens in the epistemology of consciousness raising, which is, to my mind, ridiculous that analytic philosophers have not talked about the epistemology of consciousness raising, or even the epistemology of paradigm shifts. Anyway, but that's a separate conversation. Okay, so, via negativa. If we know what is just and unjust, then it would seem that the proper target of ideology critique simply follows. Disrupt the cultural techne that prevents us from valuing things aptly, and disrupt those social structures that produce injustice. But of course, we don't have a theory at the moment in our conversation about what is just and unjust, that is going to cross over these different groups. However, we do not need to know what justice is, or have a complete moral theory to engage in social critique. We can begin with knowledge of an injustice, because we just might know, I don't have a theory of justice, but I know that rape is wrong. Right? I might not have a theory of justice, but I know homelessness is wrong. I might not have a theory of justice, but treating people differently based on their appearance of their skin, that's wrong. No, I don't need a fancy theory of justice or a complete theory of justice, or to know what justice is, to know that these are wrong. You think not? Oh my goodness,
no,
Leandro, go ahead.
The KKK doesn't think that the last thing you said is right.
Oh no, you're right. No, I agree. But I do think all I'm saying is it's possible to have knowledge of an injustice without having a whole theory. We're going to worry about how you know that something is an injustice. But I think that doesn't require a theory of justice.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to hear how they're going to
Yeah.
come to know that we do know that this is an instance of
I think
injustice.
that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
So catch me at the end, and if I haven't, not that I haven't convinced you, I'm sure I won't, but show me where the problems are. Okay? Because I think that what people often think is that you have to have a theory of justice that captures the essence of justice and would tell us what justice is in all possible worlds and all of that sort of thing. I think that that's like, really? I don't even imagine other possible worlds. So anyway, but you get that part. Okay. Also, Iris Young thinks that there are 5 faces of oppression, And she thinks it's not like you can just give simple, necessary, and sufficient conditions. So she thinks that it includes exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, systematic violence, and cultural imperialism. And they're not all that they can't be one's not reducible to the other. So we may need a kind of heterogeneous analysis of injustice. Okay, I think that what this suggests is that we approach the project through what's called a via negativa, the dark spot here. It's much harder to come up with a full account that determines what is right and good than to identify how things go wrong. Non-ideal theory often begins with a situated understanding of the wrongs that should be corrected, and one doesn't need to know what would be ideal in order to make progress. So part of what I think is going on here, this is anticipating more concerns, is that many different theories, you have theory 1 and theory 2 and theory 3, can agree on the central cases of injustice. So rape. There are not very many theories of justice that say systematic rape, A-OK, or drowning babies, just fine, you know? And so what happens is that if you think you have to know what justice is before you can begin the project, you'd have to differentiate and sort of say, this is the right one and the others are wrong. But I think that in many of the cases that we're talking about, the injustice is about as vivid as systematic rape is fine. You know, no problem, we're not going to worry about it. Because what we're trying to do is change the world to remove that horrible injustice. And it's compatible with a lot of different theories of justice to do that. It also, this has to do with the ideal. I think that we don't have to know what would be the best theory in all possible worlds. What we need to know is what's wrong in this world that makes it so terrible, and sort of try to alleviate that. Okay, all right. So, contextual and anti-utopian strategies. This is a great, I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is Bansky. Do you know Bansky? Yeah, okay, this is a Bansky. I love it. Okay, so the way that I think we should pursue a non-ideal theory, and I'm going to put this away so I don't use it again because it doesn't have enough ink in it, but here this one does. First, there are many ways to organize social life, so my goal is not to ask what practices are the best way, right? Because, and the example I used yesterday is, it's a social norm in some places that you eat 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But you don't have to say everyone in the world needs to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Because some people have a main meal in the middle of the day and then they'll snacks at the other times of the day, or just coffee in the morning and then the main meal and a snack at night. So there are lots of different ways to organize how we consume food, and there's not a single best way to do it. Contextual solutions, so a normative critical social theory provides tools to identify ways in which our current practices are inadequate so we can do better. But what counts as better is a contextual matter. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions, and this is connected to the fact that what's better will depend on local factors such as the geography, economy, cultural traditions, and human biology. So I again mentioned this yesterday, that I have a good friend from Iceland, and she and I have talked about vegetarianism and veganism a lot because I'm a vegan, and she says, yes, but in Iceland, people would never have been able to live there if they were all trying to be vegetarians back in the day, because there's not a long enough season to grow vegetables and grains of that kind to survive the winter. You need to fish. And so the better, I think, is going to have to depend on, and also culture, history and all of that are going to make an important difference. And because in existing societies, injustice is already rampant, rectification is a priority, and resistance is the starting point. So starting now and saying, well, wouldn't it be great if we had this utopia let's sort of imagine what the utopia would be. And my feeling is, yeah, after we stop trafficking in women, right? We'll get to that, believe me. But let's start on the ground. Okay. In addition, I think that we're not starting the normative inquiry from scratch. Those engaged in a justified political resistance cannot avoid the claim that there are some moral truths. So the task is not to argue for a general objective basis for moral judgment. And this is because we're already in, the people I'm talking to and engaged with are already in a project of resistance. They're saying trafficking in women is wrong. And for them to say, but maybe there are no objective truths. And I'm like, let's not go there. We don't have to go back there. We've already gotten this far. And it's actually true that most moral theories would grant that. Do we have to go back and argue about the objective basis for moral truth? I don't think so. It's not the pressing thing. If philosophers want to do that, yeah, go ahead. I love it. But I don't have to do it, right? Because I think that the concerns that I have do not need that as a foundation for our intervention. We're also aiming at positional vulnerability. An individual can be treated unjustly qua an individual. So someone could, steal something that I have that is valuable, but we're not really worried about that. Or I could break my promise. Okay, those are bad things that happen, but they happen in our face-to-face interactions or in our individual-to-individual interactions. Within the social domain, individuals are vulnerable to perpetrating or suffering injustice by virtue of their social positions. And the aim of critique is to identify and eliminate this positional vulnerability. So we're not trying to say, okay, we want social justice, so you'll never have anything bad happen to you anymore. People will still break their promises to you, even in a just society, right? That is not what we're trying to fix. We're trying to fix that people not break their promises to you because you're black, or because you're a woman, or because you don't speak English, or because you're an immigrant. That's what we're worried about. But just bad people, yeah, they're always going to be bad people. And we're just trying to avoid the systematic, targeting of groups. And again, the site of ideology critique is the social domain. The primary issues, on my view, concern what practices we should engage in, what social norms we should embrace, and how we should go on together. So we're trying to figure out, given that we live in a system like this, and the system very much depends on our coordination through participation in practices, what are these practices that we should engage in? Should we engage in seminars like this? Yes, they're wonderful. Should we engage in getting together for a cup of coffee? Well, provided the coffee isn't extracted from the global south and sold for a profit in the north, yeah, etc. But, we're saying some practices are just fine, but we're trying to figure out which of the practices are the problematic practices that render people in certain positions especially vulnerable, and get rid of those, and that will have an effect on the whole system, I think, but those are the ones that we're targeting. Okay? With this, I think now, okay, I've got a couple more slides. I got one more slide. Okay. Or acontextual, they may be path dependent. What is valuable depends on what is available to value. So I think a lot of people, when they think about value, they think, okay, we've got to stop, we've got to figure out whether art is of universal value for all time because the value of art has been written into Plato's heaven, or something like that. Art might be a bad example because it might have that value, but anyway, what about, there's certain things that we might value that, certain kinds of art, I think, don't have that quality of being, good for all time. And that's in part because art is this sort of thing that evolves over time, and what is artistically valuable varies over time. Okay, but it still might be objective. And I actually think there is objective value in anyway, let me go. Okay, so let's see. This is a quote from Jack Balkin, and he says, "Values are not so much what humans have as what they do and feel. Human beings possess an inexhaustible drive to evaluate, to pronounce what is good and bad, beautiful and ugly, advantageous and disadvantageous. Without culture, human values are inchoate and indeterminate, and through culture they become differentiated, articulated, and refined." And so I have this picture here because Balkin has this wonderful example, and he says, think about aesthetic value, and think about rock and roll. Rock and roll is aesthetically valuable. But how could it have been aesthetically valuable before there were electric guitars, right? You had to have electric guitars. You had to have a genre of rock and roll, right? Well, I did say a genre of music that made it possible for rock and roll to be of value. And then you can do that for smaller, like grunge or techno rock or all of these things. They have value, but they don't have eternal value. They have value because of their position in a genre and in a genre of music with certain instruments that became available. And so what he's suggesting is that might be true also of other moral values. So he considers the value of honor. Honor is something valuable. But honor sort of ended up kind of feeding into an inequitable society because the people who had honor were the aristocrats, right? And the workers, their honor and dignity don't really matter. And so you sort of say, okay, well, within a certain historical tradition, honor had value, but it was surpassed once we developed some values of equity. But equity doesn't even have a place in society until we get to a certain point in history. I think that's what he's saying. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is that when we're talking about what is good and bad, beautiful and ugly, advantageous and disadvantageous, we have to situate our inquiry historically and culturally and understand there may be these abstract things that we're, like, rape, sexual trafficking, homelessness, grinding poverty, lack of medical care, those sorts of things. There's this general sense that those things are bad. But when we're trying to figure out what it is that's really valuable here and now, we've got to situate it culturally, historically, the way we situate rock and roll. Okay, this is the end of this section. So questions?
Can we go
Yeah,
back to
please.
the slide? So isn't that basically that quote by Balkin just sort of stating again that picture that you have, that some contingent cultural technique will determine what someone values?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And so,
But what he's saying is more than that, is he's saying that rock and roll is valuable. It's not just that we think it's valuable.
okay, yeah. And so how are we gonna get out of, because we want to correct those contingent cultural techniques that have gone wrong,
Yeah,
those ideologies.
yeah, that's right.
How are we gonna do to change that? I still cannot see.
Okay, well, you have to be patient.
Okay.
Patience is a virtue.
Yeah.
Patience is a virtue. Yeah. So I do think that what he believes is there are, and I quoted this recently, that humans also create horrible things, right? That the Holocaust, right? The, sexual slavery, all of these things. And just the fact that humans created it doesn't mean that it's good, right? Even if a lot of people think it's good, it doesn't mean that it's good. And this is because he thinks that it doesn't exemplify one of our indeterminate senses of value.
Yeah, but then I've got a different cultural technique from yours.
Yeah.
Mine might be an ideology, so, but from my point of view, it isn't. And apparently, according to this this quote.
So I think his picture
All-
is this. Oh, sorry, go ahead, I didn't mean to
Sorry,
interrupt.
all cultural techniques gives you a value that does exist?
No, I don't think he means that. I think he means that this quote says that we have all these differentiated and articulated values, but I think that he thinks that human values are going to be these indeterminate things. So you say, pain is bad, pro tanto, it's not, a shot, a vaccine is not necessarily bad even though it's painful. But at least pro tanto pain is bad, most pains are bad. Bodily integrity is good. Okay, so you have a bunch of things that are, pretty broadly accepted. And then you might have some that are even more indeterminate, something like, we are equals. What the hell does that mean, right? It's not clear what it means, right? And that's like been the history of liberalism forever. What does that mean? Okay, so then what happens is that people interpret these and contextualize them. These are the inchoate and indeterminate. Because I think that they might say, well, is emotional pain? What kind of pain we're talking about? Bad? How bad? What's my body? Is it does a slave's body, does that count as a body that has integrity? So you can't force it to do certain things. So there are all of these sort of, and I think he believes that these are like the honor, equality. These change, but they're more stable and they're more shared across cultures. That's what he thinks. And then what happens is that we come along and say, have a practice of sex trafficking, and we go, hey, wait a minute, that's a violation of bodily integrity. And other people might argue, no, it's not, because women don't count, right? And so then we have to come up to here, and they go, but wait, women do count. And then we keep arguing about it by reference to these indeterminate values, and think that these are supposed to be kind of ones that are at least in principle shared.
Okay.
But they might not be. So that's one way to think about it. As I mentioned, I think Anderson thinks about it a different way of how to get to these. She thinks that, okay, you have a group over here that has slaves, and then you have a group over here as no slaves, and we are living close to each other, so we have to sort out, are there going to be slaves or no slaves? And these people fight a war with those people and they win. No, you shouldn't put it that way. Not the best example, because that's not supposed to be how it works. So what happens is that you have a conversation over a period of time and come to agree that there's some principle according to which you could settle that dispute. And then this group is opposed to that group over here, and then you have to settle another dispute. And you sort of work your way up in this pragmatist sort of way to these things. And then we come to, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, as the ultimate moral principle of a particular moment in history with a particular set of conflicting societies and those sorts of things. But it can be thrown out if another society that we have to coordinate with starts saying, I don't accept that. And then we have to find another one. So there are two, I think there's a kind of top-down and bottom-up way to think about it.
But you still need those common values, right?
You need something in common,
Yeah.
but not determinate values.
No.
Yeah, you need something.
But you need something in common so that you can say this is better than that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, so, and I'm worried about whether you always have that common ground.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I often am searching for a common ground with others. And I think that part of what happens is that, we start with something like this, and someone says, well, we're not equals because some are better philosophers than others. And you go, no, I didn't mean equal in that sense. And then you go through and they said, well, what sense? And I said, we're kind of equal in the moral universe. And they said, no, we're not. Some people are really bad and they tell lies all the time. They're not equal. And then you have to go through this process of sorting through what it means to be moral equals. And I think there's often a breakdown. There comes to be a breakdown here. And then we don't have that common ground. And then I think my own view is that you stop talking and you start engaging in practices with people and change them by giving them new experiences.
But then why would you think that those experiences are the right experiences that you should have, that your point of view is a correct one?
Well, I'm going to go and hang out with them too. We hang out with each other and sort of see.
So you have to be open also to maybe change your mind.
Yeah, totally. But part of it is that I think that, and this is something that, I think that we gain moral knowledge through experience and through emotion. Like that's just, and I think sometimes that's not really taken for granted. That it's supposed to be that you have to agree on a principle, right? And I don't think we really do have to agree on a principle. The principles often don't really get at what's important to people. And so if you say, what do you mean equals? And you say, well, come with me on the subway and we'll ride the subway together for a couple of days. I have relatives who live in Texas and they spend all their time with white people, right? They don't, the only experience they have with black people is on TV, in the news, right? And so I feel like saying, and they're afraid of black people, they have lots of stereotypes about black people. And so I feel like saying, come and hang out with me in Cambridge. My family, I have black kids. Come and hang out with one of my nephews. He didn't tell me straight this, he told his brother he wouldn't come to our house to have dinner when he was in town because he didn't want to sit down at the table with my kids. That's intense, right? And my father-in-law was opposed to our adopting our kids because, as he said, you have so much to offer children, why are you going to waste it on the Schwarze? So, you know, I've been there, but I do think that sometimes people, and I live in a bubble, I don't doubt that. I try to acknowledge that trad wives have good in their world, they're good things. And I think that, and that's in part because I grew up with someone who was basically a trad wife, my mom. I have that experience of her. And so I think that, you know, a lot of times people are in these kind of experiential bubbles and they don't, and I think we do have you can develop a sensibility for things that are valuable and connect with, and it's not all about conversations and convincing people of things.
No, I was thinking that it was like a lot of rational conversation, deliberation, and I was thinking about your notion of vulnerability, because it's a bodily experience,
it is.
But it, like according to Butler, I know she may be too continental for me.
No, I love Butler. I love
okay.
Butler and Beauvoir and
Okay,
Foucault and Althusser and Bourdieu, all of them.
No, because it's also like a shared experience, but when you can like make a space for justice and for this experience of injustice, because, and it connects you to life as well.
So what Liz Anderson, she has a really interesting paper. She says that you can do empirical inquiry into what distorts moral experience. You can, so being rich distorts moral experience. If you're really, really rich, you don't care about anybody else because you don't have to, right? And so you can do, you know, do studies of rich people and non-rich people of various kinds. And the non-rich people of various kinds all have, you know, some level of concern for the other. The rich people, like, I don't give a shit, you know, and I don't have to. So there. And there's some evidence there that they kind of lack empathy and that they lack kind of moral sensibility. And so she says, so if the rich people are in charge, we have reason to think that they don't have the information, the knowledge, the moral knowledge that is required to really shape things correctly. So there's a lot that I need to think more about here, but I'm going to move forward because otherwise we'll be stuck. And I think I have more to say that might come up and you can tell me if it helps. Okay. So societies are fragmented and contradictory. This is cute. Skype, email, Slack, Hangout, Signal, Zephyr, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, Telegram, Twitter, well, X, whatever, all these Snapchat, we're all fragmented in our little worlds. Social critique can at the very least draw on our inchoate and indeterminate sense of justice and its articulation in different contexts to construct and demand a better alternative. So I'm assuming that when I'm engaged in critique, I've got some interdeterminate stuff that I share with a lot of people, not with everybody, but I share with a lot of people, and I'm trying to build on that. The fragmentation of our social practices and relative autonomy of these systems generates tensions and contradictions, and comparisons across cultures and subcultures illuminate different forms of life. So this goes back to Mariela, and where we have to cross in and out, and so we can see that this one doesn't work, this one does work, or something like that. And this can prompt reflection on our normative resources. So it may be efficient to do it this way, but it really hurts in some way or other. And so maybe we have to balance efficiency with something else. Okay, so in 1974, a group of black women started meeting in response to their experiences in everyday life in the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement. They're called the Combahee River Collective. Their frustration had roots in their situation, the political realization that comes from the seemingly personal experiences of individual black women's lives. So this seemingly personal experiences is where it seems to be just me, but it's actually us. That's it. And also the failures of the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement to give them the tools to develop an adequate response. They said there was no way of conceptualizing what was so apparent to us, what we knew was really happening. Through a process of consciousness raising, they explored the experiential, cultural, and political dimensions of their experience and developed new terms and concepts. So, for example, we discovered that all of us, because we were smart, had also been considered ugly, smart ugly. And so smart ugly crystallized the way in which most of us had been forced to develop our intellects at great cost to our social lives. So they, again, they're finding this personal experience that they saw was more general. They were looking for ways of conceptualizing this experience of being left out, being disrespected in both of these movements, and then they started developing new language, smart ugly, or et cetera, et cetera. Through consciousness raising, they reached the shared belief that black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, but because our need as human persons for autonomy and to be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. So I think that there was, in the civil rights movement, they were women, so they weren't fully included. In the women's liberation movement, they were black, so they were not fully included. They all came to have this feeling that they were left out, that they were marginalized, they were vulnerable, their needs weren't being met, and so they came together and identified that and said, no, we deserve to be liberated, not as black or as women, but as black women. Black women deserve their own liberation. Okay. So the group that persisted through 1977, when the statement was written, decided that consciousness raising was not enough. They developed a study group and decided to promote their cause through writing, publishing, lecturing, and other activist organizing. And they conclude, we believe in collective process and non-hierarchical distribution of power within our own group, and in our vision of a revolutionary society. We're committed to a continual examination of our politics as they develop through criticism and self-criticism as an essential aspect of our practice. So this goes through that you're trying to build it on the ground and recognize that it's going to be really hard to have a non-hierarchical distribution of power, and we're going to have to just be in a process of liberation, not a one-time liberation, because revolution and liberation is not a one-time event. Okay, so Jane Mansbridge, professor at Harvard, uses the term oppositional consciousness to capture a particular kind of response to oppression. She suggests that oppositional conscious and liberation movements requires a gut refusal to be subordinated, rooted somewhere in every human being. To form an effective basis for collective action, gut refusals need cognitive and emotional organizing. They need an injustice frame. They need an apparatus involving both reason and emotion. And she distinguishes liberation movements from movements that are other kinds of social justice movements like vegetarianism or animal rights or something, or peace or environmentalism. Those are less liberation movements. Liberation movements where a group wants their own liberation. They want to be free from oppression. Okay, so this, I think, this gut refusal to be subordinated, Iris Young calls a desiring negation. She says desire creates the distance, the negation that opens the space for criticism of what is. This critical distance does not occur on the basis of some previously discovered rational ideas of the good and the just. On the contrary, the ideas of the good and the just arise from the desiring negation that action brings to what is given. So I think the Combahee River Collective, the black women were desiring negation. They say, I refuse to be left out anymore. I'm so sick of this, right? Do not do this to me anymore. And this often is a site for, people come together, and at first just seems like it's a, people just complaining and venting and whatever like that. And there's a negative vibe, right? But that negative vibe can become a source of collective energy to see that, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. It's not just that we're all frustrated. We're frustrated for the same reason. We're frustrated because there's something that's a barrier to us. Okay. This is continue Young. Each social reality presents its own realized possibilities, experienced as lacks and desires. Norms and ideals arrive from the yearning that is an expression of freedom. It does not have to be this way. It could be otherwise. So here, the via negativa, the negative, is connected in Jung's mind to a sense of possibility. Because what happens if you're just stuck in a situation and you're just complaining about the situation, it doesn't go anywhere unless you have this sense that it possibly could be different, right? We could protest. We could do it differently. We could find a way out. Right? And this is at that moment you've got a paradigm shift. It's both a paradigm that it's not just my fault, it's the fault out there, and things could actually be different. That's where the paradigm shift happens. Okay, so drawing on empirical case studies, this is a book by Mansbridge and Alden Morris. It's 2001, and it's called Oppositional Consciousness. It's a series of case studies of where groups formed oppositional consciousness. They say that certain tools are valuable in moving from a gut refusal to an injustice frame. Mansbridge says, an existing oppositional culture provides, first, ideas, rituals, and long-standing patterns of interaction that overt political struggle can refine and develop to create a more mature oppositional consciousness. So what I think she has in mind here is like the women's liberation movement drew on the black liberation movement. The black liberation movement drew on the working class liberation movement. There are ideas that are in the culture that are available that you can think about. The theory, the concept of exploitation. Okay, that's a concept that you can draw on. Then a ritual, a protest could be a ritual. and patterns of interaction. We develop a union if you're in the working class. What do you do if you're women? Do you develop a union? Well, it's kind of hard to develop a union. So what do you do that might be comparable to a union, etc.? Okay, second, a history of segregation with some autonomy, providing free spaces for the elaboration and testing of ideas. This was really important in the 1960s and 70s women's liberation movement because women were so often expected to live in nuclear families. And so they were, or also in places where people live very rural, like the potatoes and the sack of potatoes. It's very hard to organize if you don't get to see each other and spend time with each other, where segregation is important because you're trying to build an alternative picture of how the world works. And if you're always with people who are going to say, that's not what's going on really, you're just stupid, something like that, it's hard to build. Borrowing from previous successful movements, the synthesis of more than one oppositional stand, so we have different kind of models of what's really going wrong that are relevant to different experiences, mutually supportive interaction bridging divides and emotional commitments, consensus creativity by activists drawing on the traditions and practices of everyday life. So I think that she sees rightly that you have to have some kind of charismatic leaders oftentimes who are going to have creative ideas about how to work together collectively and that you will remain committed to. Oppositional consciousness transforms into a movement when those in the group demand changes in the polity, economy, or society to rectify the injustices. Should I just go on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to set a series of steps that I think take us from the desiring negation to a warranted critique. Okay, so you start with a desiring negation, and you find others, etc. And then I'm going to move step by step to a challenge or a demand that I think is warranted. Okay, the primary task is to articulate a warranted moral claim in the name of the subordinate group. The claim is made against those with whom one coordinates in a classroom, a family, an institution, a nation, and makes a demand that the terms of coordination be changed. So you're not making, so if you're at a philosophy department or a university, you're making a demand against the people who control that structure, right? If you are in a family, you could make a demand against your parents or something like that. Or a nation, you could make a demand that the laws be changed. And you're saying that our terms of coordination are not working. They're not working. And so we need to change these terms of coordination. I assume that one need not be a member of the subordinate group in order to demand justice with them, but in a liberation movement, the process of articulating a claim typically begins with those directly affected. So men can be feminists, but we're not going to start the feminist movement with men, right? Because they don't have the situated knowledge that the women have that can be turned into a critical standpoint. It's plausible that oppositional consciousness arises and can be justified in a variety of ways. I'm just going to explore a process that begins with a reaction, moves to a complaint, and results in a pro tanto moral claim. And drawing on Anderson et al. Bob Gooding-Williams, who's a critical race theorist, says, this doesn't work as well when you're trying to capture what goes on in the black liberation movement. And I'm saying, fine, you theorize what goes on there, that's fine. I'm just offering one picture, one model. The key epistemic project is to prompt a paradigm shift that enables us to see the status quo as the product of ideology, a culture that produces an unjust social reality while masking its production. Okay, this is Stonewall. This is where Stonewall is a LGBTQ bar and inn, and there was a raid on Stonewall. Many people were arrested, injured, whatever, and it was a kind of when the LGBTQ movement kind of blew up and became this big national movement. One, to start, one has a moral gut refusal to one's circumstances. Now, whining is an indication of displeasure, but does not rise to the level of a legitimate complaint against others. So how do we transform whining into complaining? Like my kids used to whine, they couldn't eat all the bag of candy. and they had a complaint, right, in their terms, complaint. And I would say, no, you're just whining. I'm not going to give it to you. You're not entitled to more, blah, blah, blah. But a complaint is different. A complaint has more of a claim on others. So I think you then test the reaction against the experience of others. So you articulate the claim to others within the same affected or vulnerable social group, and then the process from forward here is collective. So you articulate it with others, and you say, have you experienced that? And they would say, no, you were just obnoxious in class. That's why the professor shut you down, not because you're a woman, right? And so you need to have some collective affirmation of those in the same group. Create counter-publics where the subordinated complain to each other without being corrected, and consider, is the problem individual social? Is it a positional vulnerability, or just me, that I'm kind of a jerk, right? Or whatever, people get mad at me because or maybe I really am stupid, or whatever. This process involves shifting orientations to notice facts that have been included. Some of those are empirical facts. They're often morally relevant facts and facts about possibilities. So what you're doing is, this is that externalization point. Oh, so it's not just me, it's him. It's not just him, it's the structure, etc. Individuals within the group can sometimes rely on existing identities, but in other cases, new identities are called for. New shared identities, as in the Combahee River Collective, Black feminist or queer, allow for a cultivation of trust, a new language, shared interests, feminists. So men can be feminists. So you have a new group that is established. You're not just women, you're feminists. And that identity starts to take hold as you're developing the complaint. Patterns then become more visible, and new hermeneutic resources developed. In Combahee, you had smart ugly. Kate Mann has talked about misogyny. So you start building a repertoire of language to be able to describe your experience and your complaints. Now, the testing process at this stage and later stages should involve forms of bias reduction in consideration of epistemic justice of all sorts. So at this point, when we're going to try to figure out whether misogyny is a good term or smart ugly is a good term, we've got to reach out to a broader range of people, right? And talk about, well, how do we think about misogyny? And you have to include people of different racial groups if you're a woman, different genders if you're in a Black revolutionary organization. You've got to sort of really begin to test the vocabulary that you're developing across a broader range of people. Okay, this is Helen Longino and Eric Olin Wright, both of them are amazing. Then you develop a hypothesis about the source of the problem. Who or what is responsible for the problem? Is the coordination system faulty, or are there other problems? So again, I come back to philosophy departments or universities, because these are close to home. So is academic life in itself, is the structure of academic life problematic, or is the president of our university just a bad actor, right? If we had a different president, would that president run things better? And the structure is really okay, but there's just, corruption in it. Or is there something wrong with the way academic life is structured, right? And it could be both, but you've got to be clear on this. Like, there's a hypothesis that has to be tested here. You can't just assume you've got it right. So you test whether it's empirically adequate. Is the hypothesis the best explanation of the phenomenon? And I think you need to compare it with neo-Nazis and anti-vaxxers. So I think neo-Nazis, their movement, it depends on false beliefs. It depends on false beliefs about Jews. It depends on false beliefs about queer people. And so you're going to be able to say, I'm sorry, your hypothesis that Jews are the cause of all of the horrible things in the world is a false explanatory hypothesis. It just doesn't work. And you draw on resources in critical social science, and we could go into this. What is a critical? Eric Olin Wright and Helen Longino have both worked a lot on feminist philosophy of science and critical social science, but these social scientific resources are scientific resources, and they have scientific backing in the consideration of what explains what. Then you revise the hypothesis as needed. Eventually, after you've gone through this a lot, you articulate a claim challenging the practice. For example, this part of the practice is unjust, oppressive, harmful, or wronger. It's not just about the bad president. This is a problem that causes systematic disadvantage to immigrants or first-generation college students or women or things like that. This, that, or the other practice is problematic. So this is how I propose we address the justification problem, but I'm not going to propose here a theory of politics. So here we've got a claim. So then after that, and this is where I'm not going to provide the theory, but I think what happens in the movement is that you suggest proposals for corrective procedures. If deliberation concerning the claims and proposals is unsuccessful, you need to resort to non-deliberative interventions. Anderson suggests from petitioning, publicity campaigns, theatrical performances, candlelight vigils, litigation and political campaigns, street demonstrations, boycotts, teach-ins, sit-ins, picketing, strikes, and building occupations. This is what we do. We put forward a claim, this is a problem, they shut you down, and you say, I'm going to give you a new experience of a strike, right? And then maybe you'll reconsider. Or I'm going to give you a new experience. Come to our vigil and listen to the people who are testifying of the pain that they have suffered, or, you know, etc., like this. Even if a proposal is met with agreement in the public sphere, it's not the end of the story, for Anderson suggests we have to ask, does acting on the new judgments that you've accepted solve the problem originally diagnosed? And does it do so with acceptable side effects? An affirmative answer to both questions amounts to a successful test of the new judgment in an experiment in living. So sometimes you have to say, okay, we see that this particular policy is bad, let's change the policy. You could change it in a worse way, right? It's not no promise. You can't predict that in advance always. And so then you have to be willing to say, oops, we have to go back and try again, go back to the drawing board. And then you repeat that as needed. Okay, so this is coming to the end. So on this view, an oppositional consciousness is warranted insofar it moves from a gut refusal to a moral claim through a collective examination of shared experience guided by sound epistemic norms. So the norms are, it's not, you have to test your experience with the experience of others. You have to test that collective experience with other people who are not like you in that, you know, exact way. Then you have to put forward a hypothesis about what is the problem. You have to test the hypothesis to see if the hypothesis is empirically adequate, right? These are all really important empirical and political steps for gaining sound conclusions. And what norms are sound when we're talking about epistemic norms is not simply a matter of what the dominant culture recommends, but should also be guided by the best practice of social science and the lived experience of those in the subordinated group. So you can't just assume that you go to a philosopher and say, okay, so what are the good epistemic norms? You tell me, and then you just follow those. You can be informed by that, but they are problematic too, and so you're going to have to be doing this on the fly. The resulting claim is going to be made on behalf of a social group and warranted through their collective efforts. But an oppositional moral claim is not simply by virtue of being the result of such a process dispositive. That means it isn't going to be one that you immediately act on, right? Because we have politics, right? So it's a move in a process of contentious politics that deserves consideration in collective deliberation. So you put forward the claim. You say, I object to this way of organizing our social life because it hurts me and my people, and we have tested the hypothesis that this structure is the thing that's doing it. So you need to change it, right? So it's a very empirical, social theoretical process. Okay, here's the conclusion. So how do we gain normative standing to critique culture? Under conditions of ideology, there is by hypothesis a range of social practices that oppress a group. Some do not experience them oppressive. Critique sometimes targets practices that constitute value for those that you're criticizing. I've argued, however, that an important form of social critique begins amongst those affected as a resistance to the practice that they are being asked to perform. resistance arises from their knowledge that even if the practice constitutes some sort of value, it is harming them in ways that are morally problematic. They reject the ideology that makes the injustice appear harmless and articulate a moral claim against those who maintain the practice. It may be that the values of the resistant rely on when making the claims of being harmed are at odds with what others engaged in the practice value, but I think that does not delegitimize their claims. Social practices are cooperative enterprises, and if parties to the cooperation have reason to think that they're being treated unjustly or their values are being undermined, there is a pro tanto reason for all parties involved to reconsider the practice. Insisting on terms of cooperation in the face of a non-consent of the opposition, where non-consent, given that you've gone through this process of warranting your claim against others, is coercive, and it's a pro tanto wrong, and that's the normative basis for contentious politics. So here are the challenges. Are there objective moral truths by reference to which we can judge social arrangements to be unjust? Yes, but they may be path-dependent, and a standpoint epistemology may be required to know them. From what standpoint does the critic speak? Which insights of which agents are warranted? Insights from many perspectives are important. However, one form of warranted critique begins with a gut refusal, but must withstand scrutiny through a sound epistemic practice. So we rely on an oppositional standpoint achieved through consciousness raising to offer an alternative paradigm that is empirically sound and less coercive as a basis for social coordination. So that's the picture. Okay, we don't have much time.
Can I
Please.
ask about the role of care?
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether, if we are trying to engage in social critique as a form of potentially challenge this contradictedness and create other forms to relate and to coordinate, and sometimes that process involves or could potentially involve to increase vulnerability for those who are part of that. And so I'm thinking about my own research, and I'm working with women who live with HIV here in the region.
Yes.
None of them are out of the second closet.
Yeah.
And so it's really, and all of them, they share the same critiques, they have identified the same problems, the same social spheres in which they are stigmatized and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of like, somehow I'm doing ethnography, so I'm kind of like the messenger, between those women, because they don't even want to meet.
Yes, I understand.
And so I wonder how to, considering that they, already have that feeling, they have identified the problem, and they have proposals, for, to create to change the ways in which we coordinate and relate to each other.
Yes.
How to care? That may be an extreme,
No,
case
I
study, but
hear you.
in other social movements where, understanding that this involves collective action, and that requires to disclose,
Yes.
many times to disclose some aspects of your life that may increase your vulnerability.
Yes.
How to care within this process?
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. So there's two things to mention, and one is there's an author, Wendy Salkin, and I was just talking to you about her, Salkin, and she has a book called Speaking for Others. And also, this is a book, so it's Speaking for Others. Linda Alcoff has a paper also called The Problem of Speaking for Others. It's called Alcoff. It's old. And Wendy references it because it's clearly. And so one of the things that can be done is that people who have less vulnerability and more power can speak for those who are more marginalized and vulnerable. And so how does that work? And under what conditions is it legitimate? And what are your responsibilities if you do that? And I think both of them argue that there are circumstances when we, as more powerful, more secure, whatever people, have a responsibility to speak for others, but it's very delicate. And so what they're trying to do is figure out what are the conditions under which you can do that morally and hold yourself responsible. So that's, thank you so much for coming. And so that's part of it. But the other thing is that individuals who are extremely vulnerable can sometimes come out collectively. So they can collectively, and I know these individuals aren't ready to do that, but to try to build infrastructure to protect them such that if they come out publicly as a collective, then they may suffer personal indignities or shame or something like that, but it doesn't break the movement and it doesn't break their relationships to each other. Because ultimately the relationships to each other are the ones that are the most important. And so then it's scaffolding, you know, providing a social scaffold and a political scaffold and getting safer spaces to speak to a slightly larger group of people, or a kind of way to speak more anonymously, or one of the things, this is going to sound really trivial compared to what you just are talking about, but in a group I was working with about the problem of women in philosophy, we started a blog that was, what is it like to be a woman in philosophy? And people could email a particular address and names remain confidential. And then that was put on the blog. And I traveled around the country after that, giving talks about other sorts of things, and people would come up to me and say, oh, I never knew it was so hard to be a woman in philosophy. You know what I mean? And so but it was all anonymous, and so that's just a tiny example, but raising, thank you for coming. But it's a tool for raising consciousness that then can kind of grow and spread. So I think that's scaffolding to enable them and to protect them as they move forward. But it's going to be hard. I mean, there are going to be moments where they just have to face it together, I think. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
No, go, question if you
Yeah,
don't
sure.
mind. You're not committed to deliberative democracy, right?
I don't want to be, yeah.
Okay.
I am
But still-
kind of committed to democracy.
To democracy,
Yeah.
but not deliberative
Yeah,
democracy.
no.
But you do need this collective deliberation in order to get the justification behind the
Yeah,
reaction that people have.
yeah.
Now, I mean, I can see that working when the gut reaction is based on something that is contingent, but but most of us share, right? So it might be statistically typical in our I don't know, society.
For everybody or just for the oppositional group?
Yeah, for everybody.
Ah.
Because you want to convince the other group, right?
Yeah, I know, but
It's not just about me having the conviction that this should be changed. You have to show them that, right?
you do have to show them that it might be changed, but they may not be able to fully understand it. So they're going to be, I mean, like Native American rights. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of Native American life that I don't understand, but I'm someone who thinks that marginalized groups, I give them, I mean, I grant them credibility and I trust them and these sorts of things. So
But I mean, there has to be that
Something.
common ground.
there has to be some
Otherwise,
common
if
ground.
they are too far removed from the way you look at things, you understand the world and everything,
Yeah.
then it looks like you're not gonna have that justification, that on
Well,
which
you,
you can
wait. I mean, I
base it.
think you have the justification. I think you may not have illumination. So I think, again, going back to, I think you may not be able to illuminate other people, get them to see the problem. But I don't think that undermines the justification of your claim. So I can be justified in claiming that something is wrong, even if I can't convince other people of it.
I agree, but so you think that gut reaction that you have gives you actual moral knowledge about something? I mean,
I think it's a starting point, but I don't think you get moral knowledge until you go through the whole process.
and the whole process include the collective deliberation with those that...
No, the
Okay,
whole
just-
process
just
ends, it ends, so go back, I should just do it down here. So, here it is. So, okay, so it goes through, you develop the hypothesis, test the hypothesis, revise it as needed, and then you articulate a claim challenging the practice. I think you're warranted at that point.
Okay, within your group.
No, I think you're warranted. Because I think that to be warranted is to have a sound basis in empirical fact that your explanation of the pain that's occurring is this structure. And you can be justified in thinking about that, even though other people who have power are never going to believe that, right? And so, and I don't think it's just, I think this is we're looking for empirical adequacy and explanatory power. And here, it's just like scientists do that all the time and don't convince most of the public who can't even understand it. But what we're doing is saying, we have a moral claim that something is painful. We know it's painful because we're experiencing it, and we have tested it, that it's a social vulnerability and not just that I'm being an asshole. And then we have an explanation for why we are systematically suffering in this way that is empirically adequate, right? So I don't think I need to, in order to be warranted, I don't have to have common ground with someone else.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But I thought that we wanted the kind of justification that guides action and shows.
No, showing is a whole separate thing. That goes back to illumination. Okay. What I think is that I go into the public sphere and I say, I have a warranted claim against you. And people could say, shut the fuck up and go away. And I've failed to illuminate, but my claim is still valid.
But you could satisfy all these and not be, I mean, in an externalist sense, justified, right?
Why do you think that? I don't see why.
I mean, we are fallible and we might think this is a good explanation, it isn't, and we cannot think of counter-examples, we don't see the counter-arguments because in fact we all sort of agree very much on the same things, and we have lots of biases that promote the confirmation of what we already believe and stuff like that.
Yeah, but I thought that we were supposed to be dealing with that by sort of trying to as far as possible, get bias reduction. So I guess if you're a thoroughgoing externalist, all I can say, which I am most of the time, is that this is you have good reason to put this forward, and they can't dismiss you on that ground. So insofar as justification is a matter of having good reasons, you've got that. Yeah. But you may not have full externalist warrant. That's true. Yeah. That's true. And so, but I think that's enough to intervene into the public sphere with your claim. Yeah. So that seems exactly right. Yeah.
Cool. Right.
So you're justified in disruption. I guess that's what I'm interested in, is I'm justified in disrupting things because I have as good evidence as I can get that this is the basis, a legitimate basis for disruption, but I'm always going to be fallible.
Yeah, an externalist justification here won't do the trick
it won't
because you want that justification to guide your action.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have to have some sort of
You're right.
access.
You're right. So I should distinguish between, if you think warrant is externalist, warrant from...
I think normally, the epistemologist is going to think that warrant is something external.
Yeah, okay. So that's good. I should change the language of warrant then to, have solid reasons or, you know, sort of grounds for, or something like that, but I'm not necessarily going to get warrant.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's helpful.
Thanks. I don't know if anyone I mean, it's quite late. And,
I know. I'm sorry. But we did have lots of good conversation. I hope that even though I didn't, you know, even though we didn't get to talk now, we had good conversation in the middle.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure, and I'm always open to questions and challenges and suggestions, so feel free.
I would like to read that blog about human philosophy. Where
Yeah.
can I find it?
So I think it's not very active these days. It's because the person I know, it was developed by a friend of mine. Here it is. You just, what is it like to be a woman in philosophy? And just Google it.
Okay, I will.
And then there's all Assault by 1,000 Paper Cuts. Anyway, then there's also lots of different stuff here. And then there's another one. What is it like to be, I think, Sarai. Anyway, there's something like, what is it like to be a foreigner, which I think Sarai, who's from Spain and speaks Spanish, but speaks English with an accent. And so she has a blog that I can find the title of, about what is it like to be a non-English speaker, kind of. Because she has, so let me see, be a non-English. No, I can't find it.
It's okay.
But
I will search.
okay, and Sarai Ayala, maybe it will be on her website. Sacramento. Okay, this is Sarai and other stuff. Yeah, what is it like to be a foreigner in academia? Okay, well, I was close. And so if you go there, there's a blog that does the same thing for foreigner in academia that women in philosophy have.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
for this
thanks.
time.
Great questions, great engagement. I'm honored to be here, really. It's wonderful.
Thank you. And hopefully we can invite you next time down here in this house and you can stay longer.
I hope I can stay
than
longer.
a couple of days.
Yeah, that would be fun. I would enjoy that. And thank you for telling me about your research. It's really, these ethnographies do so much to really increase visibility.
Actually, I work somewhere between anthropology